Welcome, this is a recorded session of the Post-Quantum Cryptography Conference of the PKI Consortium. This conference would not have been possible without our sponsors, PQ Shield, SSL.com, Entrust, Keyfactor, HID Global, and the organizational support of the Post-Quantum Cryptography Working Group of the PKI Consortium, and in particular, Entrust, Keyfactor, and Logius. Would you like to join the PKI Consortium? Go to pkic.org/join, or contact us if you would like to become a sponsor.
Okay, our next presenter in this room, and I apologize, I'm probably going to mess up your surname, is Pano Kampankis, is that right? You messed it up. I messed it up, okay, good. At least I was honest about it. Principal Security Engineer at AWS. He has dedicated his career to making security protocols more interoperable and robust. His work at AWS involves developing cryptographically secure tools while actively contributing to industry standards and ensuring the future of secure communications. So with that, I'll leave it to you, and I'll get your name right, I promise, by the end of the this event.
You forgot to say I play good basketball. Okay, so my name is Panos Kampanakis. I work for AWS. And this session, I'm going to talk about some experiments that we did recently to investigate the impact of ML-DSA on actual web page metrics. We will not focus on TLS specifically, but on the web user experience metrics. So that's the investigation that I did for this. So let me summarize the problem. Luke talked about it previously, but let me summarize it one more time. So the problem is that the ML-DSA public keys and signatures are much bigger than what we have today with the CDSA or RSA. So I have a certificate here. It's a server certificate. It includes a public key and 4 signatures. So that adds up, right? So if we replace all the whole certificate chain and the signatures in the handshake, in a TLS handshake for the web, it adds up. So the data is going to increase, the handshake data is going to increase by about 15 kilobytes, right? So that's the challenge. We have an extra 15 kilobytes before we transfer any application data. And that could make the performance of these connections worse, right? So that's the challenge. That's why I investigated this. So the motivation is some things we have been talking about related to these extra 15 kilobytes in the industry. So there have been some arguments or points that have been made, and I'm paraphrasing them here, but that's why I wanted to investigate these claims. So the most basic claim is that 15 extra kilobytes for every connection before you see any data is a lot. And that's fair. It's additional data that we didn't have to have in there. So that's a lot. But then I also wanted to quantify some other claims. So I'm paraphrasing the claims here. 15 kilobytes will deteriorate the user performance by a lot. 7 kilobytes would lead to awfully high page degradation. Even 2 kilobytes in the handshake will be very painful. So these are some claims I wanted to try to quantify by looking at actual page metrics, not just the TLS connection. So that's the motivation for this work. So just to tease intuitively the example, let's say we have a web page that we're loading on a client, and the client has 1 megabps speed, and the round trip between the client and the server is 150 milliseconds. That's a typical round trip for a mobile connection, let's say. So 15 extra kilobytes for ML-DSA at 1 megabps is 120 milliseconds additional time for every handshake and every connection. So that's 120 milliseconds additionally. The round trip is 150. That means for the TLS handshake, excluding TCP, the slowdown is 66%. The box was aligned in my slides, but it's not aligned here. Okay, I couldn't predict that. So 66% slower TLS handshake. 66 is a big number. It's a great deterioration of handshake performance. But now let's add the DNS lookup, let's add the TCP handshake, let's add the HTTP request response. So these are extra round trips. That means that the time to first byte, that's the time that it takes to see the first byte for the connection, is 19% slower. So we went from 66 to 19 for the time to first byte. At the time to first byte, the user hasn't seen anything. The application show 1 byte, but the user has not realized that they are 19% slower up to that point, because there's nothing showing, right? So when I open my Instagram, what do? I scroll. I have to see my favorite influencer there. So the influencer wakes up in the morning, the hair is perfect, the lighting is perfect, they take a nice picture, and they talk about how inspired they are for their day starting. So let's say that this picture that I'll see on my scroll, that's what I'll notice. And let's say that's 20 kilobytes. The pictures are bigger. Like when you see Kim Kardashian's pictures, they're much bigger. But let's say it's 20 kilobytes for this thing. Let's be conservative. So the user is going to notice 20 kilobytes, so I need to transfer 20 extra kilobytes. And also my application has to render it. So let's say that that takes 100 milliseconds. If we add all this up, my eye is going to catch a 13% slowdown. So ML-DSA will slow down the handshake by 66%, but my eye is going to realize a 13% slowdown. The reason is that a lot of things happen other than the handshake for my eye to see when I'm browsing. So that's the intuition. That's what I wanted to investigate here. So the measurements that I did were using a great tool that's called webpagetest.org that benchmarks web pages. I investigated popular web pages on the web. We used Chrome browser caching enabled, so we don't have to transfer everything. We want to make the pages light so they're faster. And I used 4 scenarios that change the speed of this connection. So it was 4G, cable, and 3G. So that, these are the things that I used for this initial investigation, and the metrics that matter to the user that I was able to check are the time to first byte. It's the first contentful paint. The first contentful paint is a metric that shows the first thing that shows on the page. It could be some text, it could be some little image, it could be anything. It's the document complete time. So basically it's the time that it takes to load everything on the page. And the last one is the largest contentful paint, which is the largest thing on the page. So these are the things that the user sees, like the time to first byte they don't see, but the other things, the other metrics affect the user experience. There were 2 more metrics that I did not look at. This is the cumulative layout shift and the interactive next paint. I didn't measure those, so I can't make any claims. So how did you measure that? So I couldn't go to Google and say, hey, I'll put in front of your website, let me put some ML-DSA and let me measure the performance, right? We couldn't do that. So I extrapolated the impact. So basically, every page pulls a bunch of resources. Here I have YouTube. So when I was browsing YouTube, the browser was pulling a bunch of resources from different places, right? So you see them there on the left. The browser is visiting a bunch of things and pulling resources down in order to render them. And then my metric of interest here, let's say it was LCP. So I know at 2.5 seconds, the LCP was hitting, like the browser was loading the largest contentful paint. So at that point, I knew we have 2 connections, 2 handshakes there that affect that metric because they happened beforehand. So basically, I was extrapolating the slowdown of all these connections and how they would shift the metric to the right, because that means the user would see the difference, right? Classical versus post-quantum. So if we introduced ML-DSA in these connections, I was able to extrapolate how much slower the LCP would be. Okay, so The 4G scenario is 9 megabps up, 9 megabps down, and 170 milliseconds round trip. The first thing to notice is the size. So we had browser caching here, and we see that these pages, they're popular web pages, they were pulling down significant amounts of data, in the hundreds. So they do pull down a bunch of content. There are a few, though, that did not. So for the most part, these pages that I was visiting at that time were the homepage of these websites. So the homepage usually is light, right? So it asks you to log in. So I have to say that this was not a perfect choice that I made at the time because it was the login screen that made these pages lighter. But when I investigated the logged in version of these pages, they were still transferring good amounts of data. So let me give you an example. At the time, Wikipedia, I was loading the Wikipedia page, and it had a bunch of images that were 57 kilobytes, 79, 25, 290. So there were a lot of kilobytes for these pages. And I'm not showing them here because I don't know if they were licensed, so I didn't want to get sued. But there were a bunch of pages in Wikipedia, and then there was some HTML, 26 kilobytes, and some JavaScript, that was 62. So all these adds up to 583, right? So the intuition is, will 10 or 15 kilobytes for ML-DSA really matter for these 583 kilobytes total? At this point, I have to say, when we use browser caching, these things were not coming down. So we had 62 kilobytes for JavaScript when the content was fresh and the browser had cached it. So that's the amounts of data that I saw in this investigation. Let's look at the metrics. So TLS would be slower 7.8%. That's the TLS handshake only. The TTFB, the time to first byte, for these websites would be less than 2% slower. So we went from 7.8 to 2%. The FCP would be less than 1.5% slower. The largest contentful paint would be similar to that, 1.5 or 2% slower. And if we're talking about the whole document, the whole HTML content, it would be 1.5% slower. So in a sense, the intuition is confirmed, at least for these pages. We go from 7.8 on the handshake, we drop a lot. The reason is that these pages, they do a lot of things. So the eye sees a lot of things plus the slower handshake. It doesn't see only the handshake. So then I looked at the scenario where we use techniques like what Luke was talking about yesterday. We use techniques to trim down the authentication data. So let's say that the authentication data is now 10 kilobytes because we cached the intermediate CA, for example. So the numbers look better if we trim down the data. So for TLS, we would be 5% slower, and the rest of them go to 1.5%. So for these scenarios here, TLS looks far worse than the metric, than the user metric that the user is going to notice. The cable scenario was 5 megabps down, 1 megabps up, and 28 milliseconds round trip. The TLS looks bad there because the round trip is small. So TLS would be 57% slower. That's a lot. But as we add up the metrics, the TTFB would be 5 to 10% for these websites. The FCP would be 1 to 3%, and the LCP would 1.5 to basically to 4%. But anyway, there are a couple of outliers, so I say 1.5 to 6% there. So the metric impact, the impact on the metric is again, much less. Notice that there are still some metrics that are relatively high. So here I show the 3% and higher. And the reason, when I look at the data there, the reason these metrics are a little worse is either because the page is not transferring too much data, so the 10 kilobytes matter, or it's because the metric is affected by many connections. So these connections add up, and they impact more than 3%. And then there was a 3G scenario with a different speed, and the results are similar. So up to this point, I was happy. I think I had confirmed the intuition that pages transfer a lot of data, and the impact on the TLS handshake is much higher than the actual metric up to that point. But then Bas and Luke from Cloudflare wrote the blog post that said, hey, we don't see that. So their blog post was that our web connections over Quick, they see 7.8 kilobytes for the median. That means that 50% of the connections they see transfer 7.8 kilobytes. And that's little. I mean, that's not a lot. So the point is that if my web connections are small, ML-DSA with an extra 10 or 15 kilobytes will matter. So that was counterintuitive for what I was seeing before, right? So we had to look into that. So the sizes that I saw transferred in the initial tests on the lightweight pages that are home pages, they were not less than 10 kilobytes, right? So there was some contradiction there. Also, the HTTP archive that gathers data for the state of the web reports that, you know, each page transfers about 2.5 megabytes over 10 or 15 connections. 2.5 megabytes of over 10 connections means that some of these connections are chubby. They're not, you know, they're not little. So that was contradicting to what Cloudflare was seeing. So I want to see maybe, at least for the limited set of pages that I was looking at, maybe I can try to see why. So I investigated the logged-in versions of some connections again. So popular websites like Amazon, Gmail, Google, Instagram, etc. But now the logged-in versions, because we want to be more realistic what the user sees. So here's an example from Reuters, the news website. That's an example, right? So Reuters was transferring 1 megabyte for the top connection. So that's a lot. And 1 megabyte, and then there was a smaller one of 115 kilobytes. But in a sense, it was also having more than 50% of the connections be small. So you see here, 9, 8, 7 kilobytes. So in a sense, anecdotally, Reuters was confirming what Cloudflare was seeing. It had a bunch of small connections, but it also had a couple big ones, right? So I looked at all these pages, at least the 10 or 15 that I was looking at. And the summary is that the web content was not coming, for this investigation, it was not coming over small connections. So the web content for these pages was coming over 2 or 3 chubby connections that were transferring sizable amounts of kilobytes. So 168 was the lowest one, but most of them were in the megabyte versions. They were coming down over Quick or TLS 1.3, okay, we knew that. But then there were many lean connections for these pages that I looked at, which was confirming the blog by Luke and Bas. So I tried to look at these little connections, the lean connections, and there was a lot of tracking, a lot of ads, a lot of identity and geolocation services. These are third parties that are put in the pages to do something, and then they close the connection quickly. There were many 304 messages for browser caching. When the browser has it cached, you know, there's a 304 coming back. These connections are usually small, and there were some small elements and stuff. So I call these small lean connections peripheral web content. Most of these things are not rendered. Not all of them, some of them are rendered, but most of these things are not rendered. And it's not the actual web content that we see most of the time. So here's an example. I had a plugin in my browser, so there was a 7 kilobyte connection with every page that was going to Capital One Shopping, trying to give me something to buy. LinkedIn had an ads third party that was doing 5 kilobytes every time. Reuters had a tracking service that was doing 6 kilobytes over TLS. MSN.com had some ad blocking resilient ad service. So you couldn't block that thing. But it was opening a 6 kilobyte connection every time. So these are some examples of the lean connections that I was seeing. So let me summarize. I mean, this was a limited study. It didn't have a gazillion websites. It was just popular websites, 10 or 15, and we might extend that study a little more. The takeaways are that 15 kilobytes extra for ML-DSA is probably a lot. So we should try to trim it down, use some of these techniques that have been proposed to trim down the amount of authentication data in these connections. The pages vary a lot, so they do different things. But they usually transfer the web content over a few chubby connections. These connections will not be affected a lot by 10 extra kilobytes. If you're transferring 1 megabyte, 10 kilobytes don't matter. But there's these lean connections that will be affected. So lean connections will be affected and will be slowed down. Will that affect user experience, is the question. So intuitively, if these lean connections are not rendered on the browser, that should not affect the user. But that's an intuition. I haven't tested it, so who knows? Like, we should test that. We should test the slower lean connections, and if they're going to be noticeable in these user metrics that I talked about earlier. So the final point is TLS and TTFB gives us a good intuition about impact, but at least for the web, we should look at the web user metrics more to try to investigate impact, because a page does a lot of things than just the TLS handshake. That's what I had. Perfect timing. Thank you.
Hi, Panos. This is really cool work.
Thank you, Mike.
So if I took the right takeaway here, it's that crypto is going to get more expensive. We've been living in a world where crypto is cheap, and that's going to not be true anymore. And this is mainly a web development problem. Web designers need to stop fetching content from 35 different domains and figure out how to consolidate that down to a smaller number of TLS connections.
Yeah, someone paraphrased the similar comment that when I was discussing this, and they said, okay, so this confirms that ads and tracking are bad on the web. We shouldn't use them.
That's not what I said.
So I don't know. I don't think that's true. I was just trying to measure metrics. I think, I was just trying to prove or disprove how urgent the ML-DSA impact is. So I shouldn't make any assertions about the web or the browsers. I can say that, for example, for my employer, that customers connect back to an AWS service, and they do something with an application, right? And they transfer data, usually. So these connections are one connection that transfer a lot of data. So these are, the impact these connections see will be different than what the browser sees that have a lot of small ones. So I think I was just trying to see the unique case of a browser connection that's many small, some big. I was trying to quantify that. I don't know that if I can make any general assertions about browsers or not.
Well, I mean, I think this work, it could make recommendations for web design. I think, if I'm understanding, we could say, because you're assuming, I think, that web design is static, and if a thing makes 15 connections, that's how it is. But maybe we could actually recommend that people should design websites differently.
Maybe, but I feel that, the web has a life of many years. I don't know if we should ask anyone to change because we're changing our crypto. It's a little tough. It could be a recommendation, but I would be reluctant to make it because there's a lot of history behind it.
All right, great. We have time for these two last questions. Let me bring a mic over for you. Make it easy.
Thank you, Panos. I have two things. I would like to argue that the average metric, which is what they claimed that was larger, was actually more relevant than the median, because of the average is, but my question is also did you take into account TLS session resumption?
Yeah. So for this study, session resumption would make things look much better, right? Because
Yes.
you don't get ML-DSA. So no, I did not. I think Cloudflare has posted some numbers about resumption, and they say 40% of client connections use resumption. So, but in this investigation, I was investigating the worst case.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Great session. Just a couple of small questions. So when you say ML-DSA, which parameter set you used for testing? And do you think different parameter sets will have an impact on the study or not? The number one question. And the second question is, I know that you haven't tested with composite model, but any projections based on your current study that, okay, should we test it out or what will be the impact? So these two questions.
Yeah, so in this study, basically we were playing with the data, so we were adding up 15 extra data in the extrapolations we were making. So if you say I use ML-DSA, the biggest parameter, yeah, these 15 kilobytes would probably be 20 or 21. So you can extrapolate, you know, it's going to be a little more pushed to the right, like each metric would be pushed out a little more. But, you know, I don't think it matters if it's 13 or 16. It's, you know, in the general scheme of things, 1 or 2 kilobytes will not matter. So composites or non-composites, it's between 15 or 20 extra kilobytes, which is similar to what, you know, we saw there.